In July, a filmed protest in China went viral. Plainclothed officers violently broke up demonstrators outside a bank in Zhengzhou. People wanted to know why they had lost access to their savings in a banking fraud scandal. Entrepreneur Xi, who only gave his surname, did not protest in July, but had joined a protest 2 months earlier. He said he was not able to access his savings of hundreds of thousands of dollars due to the scandal, which centered on a string of rural lenders. Vocal protests are not common in China, and the bank scuffle took place at a politically sensitive time, as Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to be appointed for a 3rd term, ensuring his place as China's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. The protests are part of a broader swell of public dissent, from mortgage strikes to COVID lockdown protests, with anger also being vented online. Some say they feel let down by the state they revered. And the protests have persisted despite a security clampdown and fears of repercussions. Lei Jingming, who participated in the July protest, was adamant in voicing his dissatisfaction. Political science at Yale University, Daniel Mattingly, said the lack of enthusiasm for political change is likely to continue.
We start with China. Lots of information in various European media analyst world. According to field data on China's current situation, China in the first half of 2023 will owe an extraordinary amount of debt to the IMF, and some even predict that the second richest country in the world will collapse its economy in the near future. There are many facts that the China economic mega disaster is in plain sight, we describe. 1. China's economic growth in 2022 is only 0.4%, far from the projections and expectations of Xi Jinping, which is 5.5%. 2. China's current debt ratio to GDP is 300%, imagine. 3. Unemployment in China, especially for the younger generation, reaches 20%. 4. The property real estate sector, which accounts for 25% of China's total GDP, where more than 60% of all people's wealth is in the property sector. In the past 2 years it has not been liquidated and has lost money. There is data. In China, the comparison of investment in the stock exchange to deposits in the real sector investment business, then owning property assets such as apartment houses and the like, is 60% behavior for the Chinese people, where this is the highest ratio in the world. Other countries, for example, like Indonesia, the property is under 20%, in grave danger if it collapses. If you own a property in China, Evergrande, the largest real estate developer in China, goes bankrupt and has a debt of $300 billion, or twice the Indonesian state budget. Then China's banking industry began to fall because the financing of the new housing sector and apartment sales fell. Even in several cities in China, as reported by Western media, began to dare to protest against the Xi Jinping government, and against. One of them refused the PCR test, then damaged the place where the PCR test was taken. Home buyers in installments boycott, refused to pay mortgage payments or installments to buy houses and apartments. There are 99 cities in China right now that many are boycotting it. This is very difficult and affects the Chinese economy very badly. There are more, namely as many as 50 million empty apartments without occupants, and there are still millions more being built that have not been completed.
In 2014, many were speculating that this could happen as soon as 2024. Dubbed by many as an economic miracle, China grew from a third world country to a global superpower in just a matter of a few decades. Few could foresee the effects that the economic reform in the late 1970s would have on the developing country. Soon, the lists of the largest companies in the world began to feature more and more Chinese enterprises. Globally, the country was one of the most important trade partners, fueling globalization on a scale never seen before. And with that power came influence. Fast forward a few years, and China finds itself in a myriad of problems, both economic and political. A catastrophic zero-COVID policy, real estate debt crisis, external infrastructure issues, internal debt issues, a mini revolt of the youth, and the slowing down of the economy are just some of the things that have been plaguing the nation recently. The results of these issues threaten the very power structures of the country. So how did China get here? And what are the consequences for the country and the world, as well as the housing market, began in 1979 with economic reform. From here, China opened up to the rest of the world. Massive civilian migration from rural locations to main city hubs ensued as people looked to improve their quality of life.
Hundreds of millions of sons and particularly daughters of Chinese farmers who moved from the farm where they were earning really the same as they were earning 1,000 years ago in Chinese history, absolute subsistence wages. They traveled 4 or 5 hours to the local city, and there they began working in the big factories, the workshop of the world.
Due to that, in 4 decades, China went from a mostly rural population to a country where 2/3 of the entire population lives in major city hubs. On top of relocations, a cultural element also boosted the sales of housing. Owning real estate was considered a source of financial stability for a family, as well as a prerequisite for marriage.
As a result of the one-child policy and the Chinese preferring male heirs, there are 35 million more men than women in China. That creates intense competition for brides, with men often having to prove their material worth. This often means owning a home.
This led to entire families and their friends pooling money to contribute to the purchase of a house for their relatives. Why, you might ask? Because the prices of apartments have gotten so out of control that according to the Financial Times, housing affordability in China is among the worst in the world. Taking into account living expenses, it would take the average earner 50 years to buy an apartment. This collective pooling of money is a major difference between the Chinese property market and the West. Little inventory and slow development combined with rapid growth led to major supply issues. Thus, prices rose and affordable housing became an issue for local governments. The solution was to issue loans to property development companies, as well as easing the credit lending standards to individuals. Due to these factors, the Chinese real estate market became a rocket ship, and it fueled massive economic growth. Some companies, like the infamous Evergrande, took full advantage of the situation and expanded aggressively, aided in a large part by the availability of cheap credit. Evergrande became so large that they even built a theme park and purchased a soccer team with some of the money. The theme park is now abandoned. You'll see why shortly, but here's how it looks like now. It really is a sad waste of money, time, and resources. Many of these property institutions quickly became the largest in the country, and many expanded projects into overseas markets. Commercial housing sales reached $2.7 trillion in 2020. In China today, the general population has about 70% of their total wealth stored in the real estate market. Let me repeat that. 70% of their total wealth is stored in the real estate market. However, the supply of housing was still short, in part due to speculation. It was commonplace to purchase a second or third home as an investment, since it was considered wise and a stable use of savings. Seeing the never-ending demand, developers created an ingenious system to further fuel expansion. These were based on 2 key pillars. First, they started to finance their operations with foreign debt. The appetite for Chinese debt and equity was increasing around the world since their massive growth brought very attractive yields. Secondly, developers created pre-sale options for buyers that quickly became the norm in the country. In it, home buyers would give money to developers for a home that has yet to be built. All they had was a promise that once it was finished, it would be theirs.
The whole construction period would take about 2 to 3 years usually. and people will start paying their mortgage way before the completion of the project.
Are we talking about months or
years? Even years, or maybe over a year, over a year and a half. In the past, it wasn't seen as a risky business because, as I said, and people would not expect developers cannot complete their home at a large scale, not like now.
While this made sense for both sides, it quickly escalated. With loose regulations around how much money the property developers needed to keep, they started to game the system to their advantage. By obtaining pre-sales, they were able to start new projects without finishing the old ones. Once the new projects yielded new pre-sales, they would use some of that money to finance the actual construction, while the rest went to new projects and so on. In essence, they created a Ponzi scheme that relied 100% on the stable and perpetual growth of the housing market. However, once the influx of people to major cities started to slow down from 4.1% in 1996 to 2.1% in 2020, the scheme started to fall apart. With a slowdown in pre-sales, developers started to rely more and more on banks and foreign debt to keep expanding. Sometimes the debt payment was too large to pay with an operating income, so they used further debt to finance their obligations. It all continued for some time, but soon the Chinese authorities entered the scheme. In August of 2020, the Chinese government implemented the 3 red lines policy. Each line represents a debt ratio that the companies had to respect. If not, their ability to contract more liabilities was severely hampered. Developers crossed all 3 lines, meaning that they were not able to increase their liabilities any further. And since Evergrande used debt to finance old liabilities, it was not long before they started to run into liquidity troubles. First, they failed to repay the wealth managers who had a direct investment in the company, and this provoked a large revolt by wealth managers and investors who went to their headquarters to protest.
In September 21, there was a hugely crucial moment.
Evergrande missed payments on wealth management products. The wealth management market in China is where ordinary people can put their savings. The money is usually going into real estate, often to companies like Evergrande. And these people who had invested hadn't got their money back. They descended on the headquarters of Evergrande in Shenzhen.
We don't know where to get our money. And now we go to Shenzhen government and nobody help us.
This was the point at which it went from it might be a crisis to, well, it probably is a crisis.
Caesar missed a $400 million bond payment in November of 2021. And in January of 2022, Shimeow Group defaulted on a $101 million loan. And most recently, Yuzo Group requested to defer a payment of offshore bonds worth $582 million. This was
Anger erupting among Chinese home buyers as property developers hold construction on their homes.
这种希望破灭的那种感觉，就有点万念俱灰了。
Since July, home buyers in over 100 cities across China have declared a mortgage boycott. Just like Tian, many home buyers are desperate. Some have taken to street demonstrations, but these have been quickly quashed, with officials citing COVID concerns. Backed into a corner, home buyers have threatened to stop payments on their mortgage in over 300 projects.
On top of that, the Chinese central bank has cut interest rates in an attempt to revive the credit and housing markets. We'll have to see what happens with this. It's not clear if the situation will subside or if more property developers go insolvent, causing civil unrest. On top of all of this, real estate-related activities represent close to 30% of total Chinese yearly GDP. If the property sectors go under, there's going to be a ripple effect. It's a risk to banks, local governments, and the stability of China. While all of that might sound bad enough, other debt issues are starting to rear their ugly head. There's been many unprofitable and huge debt-ridden infrastructure projects. One famous case is the Super-Speed Railroad. The infrastructure project began after the 2008 financial crisis as an attempt to pump money into the economy and create employment opportunities. It was a classic fiscal policy boost that worked to perfection. The project was a major success, offering employment to millions, and single-handedly pushed some industry sectors, such as steel and concrete, out of default. This was, in large part, why China avoided the turmoil that most other countries faced during the 2008 crisis. While it did save the economy from recession, the problems started right after construction finished. Since the railway connected secondary locations and not main destinations, the demand was not always there. And to add to this, the ticket prices were out of reach for the majority of the population. The lack of revenue may not have been an issue. However, this project was funded by massive amounts of debt by major banks, local governments, as well as some publicly issued bonds. From 2015 up to this day, the interest alone on these payments have surpassed the operating income of the project. That's right, the interest on the debt has been more than the company's income. As of 2021, their total liabilities are 5.9 trillion yuan, or $900 billion. In other words, 5% of the Chinese GDP. The majority of these liabilities are bonds, which were sold to state banks. Thanks to the zero-COVID lockdowns, the rail infrastructure is being used even less. As a response, the Chinese government announced an economic stimulus to lift the COVID-hit economy. This included allowing the China Railway to issue another 300 billion yuan in the form of railway construction bonds. They're doubling down on an already unprofitable venture. It seems like China is putting appearances above functionality and profitability, a path that can lead to major issues if not addressed accordingly. Due to massive amounts of debt expansion, profit motives, and poor planning, there are numerous ghost cities in China. These are areas of vast amounts of infrastructure and property that virtually remains unoccupied. The Financial Times explains.
The ratio of empty apartments in China could range between 10% and as high as 40 or even 50% in some small cities.
There are enough empty homes in China right now to house about 90 million people, greater than the population of Germany or the UK.
Newer developments were built quite quickly without a lot of consideration for, the logistics.
I've traveled to many parts of China where you go to a suburb and suddenly you see this forest of apartment blocks. Carry on for 5-10 minutes in your taxi and you're still going through apartment block after apartment block with nobody in them.
I visited one of the more famous ghost cities, Ordos, in the middle of the desert, very far away from anything. It was quite strange because it's not like there's necessarily jobs there.
To add to the internal debt issues, China is also struggling with external infrastructure projects. The Grand Belt and Road Initiative is threatening to turn out to be one of the most unprofitable global projects of all time. The initiative is a large investment into more than 100 countries. It's China's ambitious attempt at growing global influence as well as creating global links to China, in theory strengthening its import-export markets. The thing is though, investment in risky countries is just that, risky, and if not calculated properly, these investments can turn out to be very unprofitable ventures. In just 2020 and 2021, China has had to renegotiate more than $52 billion in debt, and a lot of the countries that China deals with are unwilling or unable to pay. The Belt and Road Initiative has become so large that China has become the world's largest source of development credit, overtaking the World Bank as well as the IMF. Considering that this project is political in nature, no matter how unprofitable, the state government is likely to keep financing it. China could gain untold geopolitical leverage, but it comes with the risk of a catastrophic outcome, both for the financial stability of China, as well as causing a political debacle due to its involvement in other countries' foreign affairs. As if debt issues, both on the internal and external front, are not enough, the Chinese government continues to support a zero-COVID policy to this day. The plan on paper was to eliminate the disease. The government was to be seen as competent and to be able to deal with whatever came its way. And it worked for some time. As of today, according to the official statistics, the death toll from the virus in China stands at a little over 5,000, while the US is over 1 million. No matter how staged these numbers might be, the authorities could point to this low number as a rationale for lockdowns. While the rest of the world is moving on due to herd immunity, China, on the other hand, can't do so. They've had no natural immunity.
The latest mandate is for every major city to have a test site like this within 15 minutes walk of every resident. It looks like they're going to become a permanent fixture on the streets, and having a negative result will be required for going to school, work, shopping, or eating out.
There will be no living with the virus in China. It is pursuing a pandemic victory at all costs.
Once they announced the zero-COVID policy and how it could go on for more than 5 years, the lockdown's perception in the general population's eyes quickly changed. People are now protesting lockdowns in what can only be described as a dystopian nightmare. However, even if the state wanted to, going back on its policies now would be a complete disaster, both on a humanitarian and political scale. According to Shanghai's Fudan University, the death toll could reach more than 1 million people, and it would be an admission of failure on the part of state leadership. Completely unacceptable as the government is preparing for its 20th Party Congress, where current President Xi Jinping will go on for his third consecutive term as party leader. Thus, having a slowdown of the economy and popular discontent seem to be, no matter how wrong, the only viable path for the state authorities moving forward. If they backtrack, it's weakness. And saving face is a big part of Chinese culture, and the government must showcase their superiority, no matter how staged it might seem to their Western counterparts. What does this mean for the economy? Well, to start, a massive decline in internal demand, and increasing employment, especially among the young. For educated young people, 1/5 of themselves find themselves jobless at the time of recording. On the external front, the zero-COVID policy has been one of the main issues feeding into the global recession. There's been a weakening of confidence of foreign businesses that rely on China for exports and imports. The most extreme example is Apple, who is moving some of their manufacturing of the iPhone 14 to rival India, and we've done a full episode on this story. The economic and political issues are not the only problems for the state government either. Increasing unemployment among the young and educated is quickly on the rise, climbing to a record 20% in July of this year. This is mainly due to the slowing down of the economy and the shrinking opportunities that come with it. In my 2021 episode on the Great Resignation, we touched on the popular online movement called Tang Ping, or Lie Flat. Basically, it was an online movement of youth that decided to stop playing the rat race, stop climbing that corporate ladder, and just to take things more slowly. But now, in 2022, this has evolved into something new, a more extreme movement known as Bai Lan, or to let it rot. These youth have completely decided to give up on the system and are just doing the bare minimum to get by. It's a complete shock to the older generation of Chinese who have never seen anything like this in their lifetime. The Bai Lan youth believe that there's nothing to be gained by working hard, and putting in extra effort isn't going to result in reward. It didn't take long for the Chinese government to take notice. In May of 2022, President Xi Jinping, in a speech to the entire nation, emphasized the importance of young people and their contributions to the country as a whole, stating that, quote, "China's hopes lie in youth." Reducing inequality and improving opportunities has been their main priority for some time, and yet the measures taken, such as cracking down on big tech and banning private school tutoring, so far have not helped the situation much. So the preceding was a brief summary of what's been going on in China. There was plenty that wasn't said. We didn't even get to the rural bank runs, where around 400,000 people aren't able to access their life savings. But you get the idea. So, are the clickbait titles on YouTube true? Is China going to implode? Well, the answer is more complicated than that. It seems clear that China is putting its political agenda in front of economic and humanitarian situations. The stubbornness of the ruling class has caused China to be in an uncomfortable position. A seemingly unstoppable nation suddenly has major cracks appearing in multiple places, cracks that need to be patched with more than a band-aid solution. The major thread across all of these topics covered is a loss of confidence by its people in the state government, and getting that confidence back will be a difficult challenge. Perhaps the most likely outcome may be a slow grinding recession and political upheaval in the coming years. But ultimately, it's too complicated of an analysis for anyone to give a definite answer. But there's definitely more work that needs to be done to keep things from escalating further and for the people to trust their government again. One thing is sure, the next few years for China carry a lot of risk, and whether things get a lot worse or not depends on how the situation is handled by the Chinese government. But what about the rest of the world? Well, for the rest of the world, these problems in China will certainly have major ripple effects, especially for those who rely directly on the import-export market of China. We can expect the inflationary trend to continue as Chinese supply diminishes. For the United States, this means 20% of their total imports can be affected. On top of that, the growing deglobalization trend will make prices higher as more countries bet on local production, and that means less cheap labor. For some economies like Australia, where I'm from, we might be in a lot of trouble because Australia's exports to China account for about 65% of total trade. That's a massive exposure risk, and as most Australians would know, we don't really have that many other trading partners that could back up such a loss. Specific industries will also see major setbacks. Case in point is the EV battery sector. The Chinese lithium-ion global battery production was 76%. While there are constant efforts by the European and US governments to increase their production, the stark truth is that China is a massive trading partner that can't be replaced on short notice. Lastly, it's also important to mention the investment exposure that many countries have to Chinese debt and equities. This includes many investment firms in Europe and the US, not to mention all the funds that have suffered losses from the numerous delisting of Chinese equities over the past few months. On top of that, China's slowdown could mean more difficulty for the US to issue debt since China is the second largest holder of US treasuries. On the positive side, less demand for fuel. China imports 80% of its needs, and it's going to put some downward pressure on prices, giving a little help to the energy crisis now and a small downward force on the input costs on basically every good produced. Overall, the interconnectedness between global markets has been the engine of growth for some time, both an Achilles heel and the key to economic prosperity of this century. A recession in one major economy means a global slowdown for the rest of the world. It will be very interesting to witness the changes that happen. Will this change global trading in the future? Will globalization continue to be a trend? Or after this, will countries tend to look more inward, and will production be more localized? Whether it's the outlook of China or the global economy as a whole,